Every morning, a former Navy SEAL and his German Shepherd rode the same cold city bus, unnoticed, silent, routine. The driver never smiled, never spoke, and everyone complained. No one asked why his hands shook on the wheel. As New Year's Eve approached, the dog began watching the driver instead of the doors, as if sensing something fragile running out of time. Behind that silence was a secret: night shifts, exhaustion, and a child's life tied to a job the system was ready to erase. One bus ride became a crossroads between profit and humanity, between orders followed and courage chosen. This is not a story about saving the world, but about standing still when walking away is easier. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, like the video and subscribe to Silent Paws Steady Hearts for more stories like this. The city wore its holidays like a borrowed coat. Strings of red and gold lights clung to lampposts and storefront windows, blinking dutifully against the gray mornings of late December, while the people beneath them moved faster than ever. Heads were down, shoulders hunched, hands full, eyes fixed on invisible clocks ticking somewhere just beyond reach. The air was sharp and damp, carrying the mingled scents of exhaust fumes, roasted coffee, wet pavement, and cold metal. It was festive in appearance, but stripped of warmth in practice. At exactly 6:12 a.m., Ethan Walker stepped onto Route 17. He did it every morning, not because it saved him money or time, but because routine, once carved into muscle and bone, did not loosen its grip easily. Some habits survived long after the reasons for them were gone. Ethan stood a little over 6 feet tall, his build broad and solid without excess. His shoulders were wide, his frame dense, the kind of strength shaped by function rather than display. He moved with quiet efficiency, each motion economical, deliberate. The cold barely touched him. Years spent in heat, sand, salt, and wind had recalibrated his sense of discomfort. His olive green combat shirt fit close to his body, the fabric technical and worn in all the right places. The camouflage along his sleeves had faded slightly at the seams, not neglect, but use. Beside his left leg walked Ranger. The German Shepherd was large and mature, somewhere between 6 and 7 years old, with a powerful yet disciplined build. His black saddle blended seamlessly into warm tan along his chest and legs, his coat thick and close to the body. His ears stood alert but relaxed, his posture calm. His eyes, dark amber, intelligent, steady, absorbed the world without urgency. He wore no vest that morning, no label to explain him. Only a plain, dark collar rested against his thick neck. People noticed them, when they noticed at all. Some assumed Ethan was law enforcement. Others saw Ranger's size and mistook restraint for menace. Most, however, didn't look long enough to wonder. They boarded the bus. The interior smelled faintly of disinfectant and old upholstery. The seats creaked softly as passengers settled in. A woman in a wool coat murmured irritably into her phone about running late again. No one greeted the driver. No one ever did. Walter Hayes sat behind the wheel. He was 68 years old, though his body carried more weight than his years suggested. His shoulders sloped slightly forward, his frame leaned to the point of fragility. Gray hair thinned beneath a pulled-down knit cap, and deep lines cut through his face. Lines shaped not by laughter, but by endurance. His hands rested at 10 and 2, steady and precise, gripping the steering wheel with a familiarity born of decades. Walter did not look up. He did not say good morning. He did not acknowledge Ethan, Ranger, or anyone else. The doors closed with a hiss, and the bus pulled away exactly on schedule. Ethan took his usual seat, third row on the right, aisle side. Ranger lay down immediately at his feet, folding his long body neatly into the narrow space, tail curling once before becoming still. The bus rolled forward, its engine humming softly as it merged into traffic. Routine, repetition, Survival by schedule. Low complaints drifted through the cabin, spoken just loudly enough to be shared without being owned. He never says thank you. Does he even see people? My old driver used to smile. Walter did none of those things. He drove with immaculate control, braking smoothly, accelerating evenly, the wheel never wavering beneath his hands. But Ranger noticed what others did not. The dog's ears shifted, not toward sound, but towards something subtler. His gaze lifted from the floor and fixed on the front of the bus. Not tense, not aggressive, simply attentive, watching. Ethan followed that line of attention and saw it. The slight tremor in Walter's left hand as he adjusted the mirror, the way his shoulders sagged for half a second before straightening again, the cough he tried to suppress before it escaped. Dry, shallow, exhausted. Ranger's ears rose higher at the sound. It was not alarm. It was recognition. Something tightened in Ethan's chest. He knew that look. He had worn it himself once. The look of someone running on reserves they refused to acknowledge were nearly gone. The bus stopped at Pine Street, then Oak, then Riverbend. Each stop followed the last with mechanical certainty. When the bus turned onto Market Avenue, Ethan's thoughts drifted, as they often did during these rides, to a different kind of vehicle. A convoy, a briefing room, orders delivered cleanly and professionally, a decision that made sense on paper, a village left behind, civilians unaccounted for, a silence afterward that never quite released its hold. He had followed orders, he had done his job, and something inside him had never forgiven that. That was why his attention kept returning to Walter Hayes now, why Ranger's quiet focus mattered so much. Animals did not lie to themselves. They did not rationalize exhaustion or explain it away. The bus lurched slightly as it rounded a turn. Walter's hand slipped on the wheel, only for a fraction of a second, before tightening again. Ranger's body stiffened. Ethan rested a steady hand on the dog's shoulder, and Ranger eased, his tail thumping once against the floor in quiet acknowledgement. I see it too, Ethan thought. And then the rhythm broke. The rehook came not with shouting or violence, but with something far more unsettling, a moment out of pattern. At the next stop, a man boarded late, stamping snow from his boots, irritation radiating off him in sharp waves. He muttered something under his breath, loud enough to carry. Walter did not respond. The doors closed, and the bus moved on. But Ranger did not lie back down. He remained seated, facing forward now, eyes fixed on Walter, ears fully raised. He did not growl or bark. He leaned forward slightly, as if listening for something beneath the noise of the engine and the city. Ethan frowned. Ranger only did that when something was wrong. Not dangerous, but wrong. Walter coughed again, longer this time. His shoulders trembled before he steadied them, forcing air into lungs that seemed reluctant to cooperate. The bus drifted a few inches too close to the curb before correcting course. Enough for Ethan to notice. Enough for Ranger to release a low, almost inaudible huff. Not a warning, but concern. The rest of the ride passed in subdued silence. When the bus finally reached the industrial district, Ethan stood, Ranger rising smoothly beside him. As they moved toward the door, Ethan paused briefly near the driver's seat. Walter still did not look up. But now Ethan saw the dark circles beneath his eyes, the tension locked into his jaw. Not anger, but effort. Morning, Ethan said quietly. The word felt unfamiliar. Walter blinked, then slowly lifted his gaze. His eyes were pale blue and deeply tired, worn thin by years of holding things together without complaint. For a moment, it seemed he might not respond at all. Then he nodded once, barely perceptible. Ranger met his gaze and wagged his tail, a single, slow sweep. Walter's lips twitched. Not quite a smile, but close enough to matter. Ethan stepped off the bus into the cold as the doors hissed shut behind him. Route 17 pulled away, taillights fading into the gray. Something had shifted. Walter Hayes was not rude. He was not cold. He was empty, and still showing up anyway. Ethan knew exactly what that meant. The next morning arrived colder, the kind of cold that crept through fabric and settled directly into bone. The city looked the same as it always did at dawn. Steel gray sky, damp streets, holiday lights still blinking with stubborn optimism. But Ethan felt a subtle difference in himself as he approached the bus stop. It was not anticipation exactly, more a quiet alertness, as if something begun the day before had not yet finished unfolding. Ranger walked beside him with his usual measured gait, paws steady on the concrete, breath visible in slow clouds. His ears were relaxed, but his eyes scanned the street with focused calm, cataloging movement and sound without hurry. Route 17 arrived on schedule. The doors opened. Ethan stepped inside. Walter Hayes was already at the wheel, posture rigid, hands placed with habitual precision. He looked more tired than the day before. The knit cap sat lower on his forehead, shadowing eyes ringed with darker bruises of exhaustion. His jaw was set tightly, lips pressed into a thin, colorless line. He did not look up when Ethan boarded. He did not acknowledge Ranger. The bus pulled away with the same smoothness, the same practiced control. But Ethan noticed the micro delays now, the fraction of a second longer before acceleration, the way Walter seemed to brace himself before each stop, as if the simple act of pressing the pedal required negotiation with his own body. Ranger lay down at Ethan's feet, but his body remained coiled with awareness. His head rested on his paws, yet his eyes never closed. A few stops later, the disturbance arrived. The man boarded late, nearly missing the bus as the doors hissed shut behind him. He was young, mid-20s at most, tall but loosely put together, with the kind of slouched posture that came from leaning too long against bar counters. His dark hair was unkempt, his jacket unzipped despite the cold, and the sour, unmistakable smell of alcohol followed him down the aisle. His face was flushed, eyes glassy and unfocused, irritation already simmering just beneath the surface. "Hey!" he called out, voice too loud for the enclosed space. "You gonna speed this thing up or what?" A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. Someone sighed. Walter did not respond. His gaze remained fixed on the road ahead, hands steady on the wheel. The man scoffed, laughing to himself. "Figures," he muttered, swaying slightly as he moved forward. "Old guys always driving like they got nowhere to be." Walter's left hand tightened visibly around the steering wheel. The tremor in his fingers grew more pronounced, a subtle shake he tried, and failed, to suppress. The bus slowed as it approached a red light, braking carefully, deliberately. "That's what I'm talking about," the man snapped, anger flaring. "You trying to get us all fired today?" He took another step closer to the front, past the yellow line marking the driver's space. Ranger stood. The movement was sudden, decisive. One moment he was lying still, the next he was upright, body aligned squarely between Ethan and the aisle, shoulders broad, stance firm. He did not bark. He did not bare his teeth. His ears snapped forward, eyes locked onto the man with a clarity that cut through the haze of alcohol. The man froze. "What the hell?" he muttered, instinctively taking half a step back. Ethan rose slowly, deliberately, placing himself just behind Ranger. He did not rush. He did not raise his voice. His presence alone shifted the air in the bus, grounding it, pulling tension inward rather than letting it scatter. "Sit down," Ethan said evenly. The words were calm, unadorned, carrying no threat beyond certainty. "The bus is moving." For a moment, it looked as though the man might push back. His jaw worked, irritation flickering behind unfocused eyes. Then, Ranger leaned forward just slightly, not aggressive, not advancing, simply occupying space with quiet authority. His gaze did not waver. The man swallowed, His bravado collapsed under the weight of being seen too clearly. "Whatever," he muttered, turning away. He staggered back toward an empty seat, dropping into it with a scowl, shoulders slumped, suddenly small. The bus continued forward. Walter said nothing. He did not look back. But in the mirror above the windshield, Ethan caught the reflection of his eyes. They were wide, glassy with strain, and threaded through them was something else, gratitude, unmistakable, tangled tightly with shame. Ranger remained standing. Passengers murmured softly now, tension releasing in quiet breaths. Someone shook their head. Someone else stared pointedly out the window. No one spoke directly to Walter. No one thanked Ethan. Normalcy resumed with almost cruel efficiency. Ethan did not sit down immediately. He waited, watching Ranger. The dog's posture stayed rigid, attention fixed on the driver's seat, not on the man who had caused the disturbance. That was what struck Ethan most. Ranger did not track the threat. He tracked the strain. It was wrong. Ranger was trained to identify danger, to assess escalation, to de-escalate when possible. This behavior was different. It was not protective in the usual sense. It was attentive, concerned. Walter's cough returned, harsher this time, echoing briefly in the cab before he swallowed it back. The bus drifted slightly in its lane before correcting. That was when Ethan felt it. That slow, creeping certainty that this moment mattered more than it appeared. He reached down and placed his hand on Ranger's neck, fingers pressing lightly into the thick fur. The contact was familiar, grounding. Ranger exhaled, a long, controlled breath, and after a few seconds, he lowered himself back to the floor. He did not fully relax, but the immediate tension eased. Ethan sat down. The rest of the ride passed without incident, yet something fundamental had shifted. Ethan found himself watching Walter more closely now, reading the subtle language of strain and endurance. Each stop seemed to take more out of him. Each acceleration demanded a fraction more effort. He was not angry. He was not careless. He was holding himself together through sheer will. At Ethan's stop, he stood and moved toward the door. Ranger rose beside him, fluid and silent. As they passed the driver's seat, Ethan hesitated again, compelled by something he did not yet fully understand. Walter stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, shoulders locked in place. "You handled that well," Ethan said quietly. Walter flinched, almost imperceptibly. His eyes shifted to the mirror, meeting Ethan's reflection for a brief moment. There was no pride there, no satisfaction, only the weary relief of someone who had been spared a collapse by the narrowest margin. He nodded once. Ranger wagged his tail, a single slow movement, then looked back at Ethan as if to confirm something unspoken. Outside, the cold air hit them both. Ethan paused on the sidewalk, watching the bus pull away, watching Walter's silhouette framed by the windshield as Route 17 disappeared into traffic. Ranger sat beside him, eyes still fixed in the direction the bus had gone. Ethan exhaled slowly. It occurred to him then, with a clarity that felt almost unsettling, that Ranger had not reacted to protect him at all. The dog had positioned himself instinctively, decisively, for someone else. Ranger had chosen Walter, and perhaps, Ethan realized, that choice had been made long before he himself had noticed there was a decision to be made at all. By the third morning, Ethan no longer had to look at the route schedule to know something was wrong. Route 17 arrived before dawn as usual, its headlights cutting pale tunnels through the cold air. But Walter Hayes was already ready there, earlier than necessary, seated behind the wheel with the engine idling, hands resting motionless on the steering wheel, as if he were bracing himself for something unseen. The knit cap sat low on his head, pulled down far enough to hide most of his thinning gray hair, and the collar of his uniform jacket was turned up, though the bus's heater hummed softly. He looked smaller somehow, more compressed, as if the hours had begun to fold him inward. Ethan boarded without comment. Ranger followed, padding quietly down the aisle, before settling at Ethan's feet. The dog's posture was relaxed but alert, his gaze flicking briefly to Walter, then away, as if marking a presence he had already catalogued. The ride unfolded with familiar precision. Stops, doors, the soft shuffle of commuters who never quite looked at one another. Yet Ethan noticed now what he had missed before. Walter did not stretch between routes. He did not stand or shift or roll his shoulders the way most drivers did when relieved, even briefly, of motion. When the bus paused at the terminal, he remained seated, staring forward, breathing shallowly, waiting for the next set of passengers to board. It happened again that night. Ethan had stayed late at the warehouse where he worked occasional contract jobs, unloading shipments and repairing damaged crates. Work that demanded attention but little conversation. When he stepped out into the cold, Ranger at his side, Route 17 was already waiting at the curb, lights glowing softly against the dark. Walter was still driving. The knit cap was gone now, revealing close-cropped gray hair damp with sweat. His eyes looked sunken, his face drawn tight with exhaustion. Yet his hands moved with the same careful control, guiding the bus through the streets as if muscle memory alone carried him forward. Ethan frowned. Double shifts were common during the holidays. Triple shifts were not. They rode in silence until the bus reached the hospital district. That was when someone new boarded. She was a woman in her early 30s, average height, slim but not frail, wrapped in a navy blue coat that smelled faintly of antiseptic. Her dark hair was pulled back into a low ponytail, strands escaping to frame a tired but open face. There was a softness to her features, warm brown eyes, a mouth quick to smile even when fatigue tugged at the corners, but her posture was straight, purposeful, shaped by long hours spent on her feet. She nodded politely as she passed Ethan, offering a brief smile to Ranger, who lifted his head in acknowledgement. She chose a seat a few rows ahead and exhaled slowly, shoulders dropping, as if she had finally allowed herself to feel the weight of the day. Her name, Ethan would learn, was Maya Collins. She rode Route 17 often, always late, always quiet, always carrying herself with the calm efficiency of someone accustomed to controlled chaos. A night shift pediatric nurse, she worked at the children's hospital just beyond the river, tending to bodies too small for the pain they carried. That evening, she did something unusual. As the bus slowed near the hospital entrance, Maya stood and approached the front, steadying herself against the rail. Walter glanced at her in the mirror, surprise flickering briefly across his face. "Evening, Walter," she said gently. Her voice was warm, unhurried. Walter hesitated, then nodded. "Evening?" It was the longest word Ethan had heard him speak. Maya smiled, her expression carrying a familiarity that suggested this was not their first conversation. "You're running late again." Walter's shoulders tightened. "It's fine." Maya studied his reflection for a moment, eyes sharp despite the softness of her tone. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone." Walter said nothing. The doors opened. Cold air rushed in. Maya stepped down onto the curb, pausing just long enough to add, "Try to rest, okay?" Walter nodded again, eyes fixed straight ahead. Ethan watched her walk toward the hospital doors, then turned his attention back to Walter. Ranger had risen to a seated position, ears forward, gaze following Maya, until she disappeared inside. Then the dog's attention shifted, back to the driver. Something clicked into place. The rehook came quietly, wrapped in realization rather than action. Ethan began to notice the pattern. Walter drove the early mornings. He drove the evenings, and sometimes, more often than anyone realized, he drove straight through the night, his brakes just long enough to sip coffee gone cold. No one saw it, because no one rode all those hours. No one, except Ethan and Ranger. A few nights later, Ethan stayed on the bus longer than usual, curiosity tugging at him. The city thinned as midnight approached, storefronts darkening, streets growing quieter. When the bus finally pulled to a stop near the children's hospital, Walter stood for the first time all night. He moved slowly, joints stiff, as if standing itself required calculation. Ethan followed at a distance. Walter stepped off the bus carrying a small paper bag, folded carefully at the top. He crossed the street with deliberate steps and entered the hospital through a side entrance. Ranger paused, looking back at Ethan, ears twitching, then followed without prompting. Inside, the air was warmer, heavy with disinfectant, and something faintly sweet. Children's soap, perhaps. Walter moved with practiced familiarity, nodding at a security guard, then turning down a hallway that led toward the pediatric wing. That was where Ethan saw the boy. Liam Hayes was 9 years old, small for his age, with pale skin that carried a faint blue undertone. He sat in a wheelchair near the nurse's station, bundled in a thick sweater, his dark hair cropped short and uneven, as if cut in a hurry. His eyes were too large for his thin face, bright and observant, following every movement around him with quiet curiosity. Walter knelt in front of him, movements suddenly gentler, softer. He opened the paper bag and handed Liam a sandwich, cut carefully in half, along with a small container of fruit. "Did you eat?" Walter asked. Liam nodded, smiling. "But this is better." Walter huffed quietly, something like a laugh catching in his throat. "You always say that?" Ethan stayed back, unseen, as Ranger approached slowly. The dog lowered his head, tail still, posture calm. He sat beside Liam's wheelchair and leaned slightly into the boy's leg. Warmth offered without demand. Liam's eyes widened. "He's big." "He's gentle," Walter said, glancing back and finally noticing Ethan. There was no alarm in his gaze, only resignation, as if secrets carried long enough eventually expected to be found. Ranger remained still, eyes soft, body grounded. He did not fidget or sniff. He simply stayed. Maya appeared a moment later, pausing when she saw Ethan. She took in the scene quickly, the dog, the boy, Walter's hand resting protectively on the wheelchair handle. "You followed him," she said quietly, not accusing, just stating fact. Ethan nodded once. "I wanted to understand." Maya studied him, then sighed. "Liam has a rare congenital heart condition. Treatments are expensive. His insurance is tied to Walter's employment." She hesitated, then added, "Walter's all he has." Ethan felt the words settle heavily in his chest. Ranger shifted closer to Liam, resting his head briefly against the boy's knee. Liam smiled and ran thin fingers through the thick fur. Walter watched them, eyes glistening. Outside, the city continued on, unaware. Ethan understood now. Walter was not working for money. He was working for time. As they left the hospital later that night, Ethan looked back at the glowing windows of the pediatric wing and felt a familiar weight press against his ribs. A question formed unbidden, heavy with consequence. If the system cut Walter loose, if it replaced him like a number, what else would it erase along with him? By the end of the week, the cold had settled into the city with a kind of quiet authority. It no longer announced itself with sharp winds or sudden frost. It simply existed everywhere, pressed into concrete and glass, into joints and breath, into the rhythm of days that blurred together. Ethan felt it most in the mornings, when Route 17 arrived before sunrise, and the bus lights cut through darkness like a tired promise. Walter Hayes was still there every time, already seated, already driving, already giving more hours than anyone seemed to notice. What changed was not the schedule, but Ethan's awareness of it. He began to see the gaps between shifts, the absence of relief drivers, the way Walter never truly left the bus. Even when the route paused at the terminal, Walter remained in his seat, hands resting on the wheel, eyes unfocused but open, as if he were afraid that standing up might loosen something he could not afford to lose. Walter still did not know he was being watched, not by management, not by the system, but by a former soldier and a dog who had learned long ago how to read strain before it became collapse. The discovery came by accident. Ethan had stopped by the Metroline operations building one afternoon, not with intention, but because habit pulled him there. The warehouse he worked at shared a service road with the transportation offices, and Ranger, sensing nothing unusual, followed at his side as Ethan stepped inside to use the restroom before catching the evening bus. The building smelled of stale coffee and paper, the kind of smell that belonged to fluorescent lights and long meetings. Voices carried easily through the thin walls. Ethan slowed his pace when he heard Walter's name. "After the new year," someone was saying. The voice was male, measured, edged with fatigue rather than cruelty. "We can't keep carrying legacy salaries when the numbers don't support it." Another voice responded, sharper, impatient. "The board wants cuts before Q1. Doesn't matter who it is. If he's that old, he's a liability." Ethan stopped just short of the open doorway. Inside the small office stood a man in his early 50s, average height, thinning brown hair combed carefully to one side. He wore a wrinkled button-down shirt with sleeves rolled up to the elbows and a loosened tie that had clearly been pulled tight and released too many times. His face was narrow, his jaw clean-shaven but tense, lips pressed together as if holding back words that no longer found a place to land. This was Richard Bloom. Bloom had the posture of someone who had once done physical work, shoulders slightly rounded, stance habitual rather than confident, but now spent most days behind a desk. His eyes, a faded hazel, flicked nervously between a spreadsheet on his monitor and the man standing opposite him, a regional supervisor whose polished shoes and immaculate coat marked him as someone who would leave before the buses stopped running. "I know Walter," Bloom said quietly. "He's solid, never had an incident, knows the routes better than anyone." "That's not the point," the supervisor replied. "The point is cost. We can replace him with 2 part-timers at half the expense. He finishes out the holiday surge and then we let him go." Bloom's shoulders sagged. For a moment, Ethan saw something flicker across his face. Memory, perhaps. A younger version of Bloom behind a wheel, hands gripping it the same way Walter did now. A time before spreadsheets replaced people. Bloom nodded once. "After New Year's," he said. "I'll handle it." The words landed with a finality that felt heavier than shouting. Ethan stepped back quietly, Ranger close at his heel. The dog's ears were angled forward, alert not to sound, but to the shift in Ethan's breathing. By the time they exited the building, something cold and familiar had settled into Ethan's chest, heavier than the winter air. Orders, targets, timelines. He knew this language. That evening, when Ethan boarded Route 17, Walter looked the same as always, tired, focused, determined. He greeted no one. He thanked no one. He drove. What Ethan noticed now was what Walter did after the shift ended. At the terminal, while other drivers logged off and pulled on coats, Walter remained seated. He filled out a paper form with slow, careful handwriting, then walked inside the small break room and pinned it to the board with practiced precision. When Ethan passed by later, curiosity tugging at him, he saw the words clearly. Additional availability requested. Night shifts. Holidays. Walter was signing up for more. Ranger's behavior changed subtly after that. Whenever Ethan mentioned Metroline aloud, once on the phone, once muttered under his breath, Ranger's ears flicked sharply and his posture tightened. He began positioning himself closer to Ethan's leg when they passed the operations building, eyes scanning the entrance with a focus that bordered on unease. It was not fear. It was anticipation, the kind that came before impact. Ethan had learned to trust that instinct. The rehook came not with action, but with recognition. That night, lying awake in his apartment, Ethan replayed the conversation he had overheard. After the new year, handle it. He thought of Walter kneeling in the hospital hallway, carefully handing a sandwich to a fragile boy whose life depended on a system that measured value in quarterly reports. He thought of Richard Bloom nodding, choosing silence not because he agreed, but because he was tired of fighting. And he thought of himself, years earlier, standing in formation, nodding as orders were given, knowing, without saying, that following them would cost someone else something irreplaceable. He had told himself then that he had no choice. Ranger stirred beside the bed, lifting his head to look at Ethan, eyes calm but searching. The dog moved closer, resting his chin against Ethan's knee, grounding him in the present. "You feel it too," Ethan murmured. Ranger did not move. The days passed, and nothing changed on the surface. Walter continued to drive. He continued to sign up for extra shifts. He continued to pretend that exhaustion was a manageable thing. He did not know that a decision had already been made about his future. He did not know that his name existed now only as a line item. Ethan watched him more closely than ever, noting the small signs, the way Walter braced himself before standing, the longer pauses between stops, the cough that never quite went away. He wondered how much time the system thought it was saving by cutting one man loose, and how much it would cost the rest of the world in return. One evening, as Ethan exited the bus, he caught his reflection in the dark glass of the terminal doors. Broad shoulders, military posture, a man who had once believed that obedience was the same as honor. He remembered the moment he had realized they were not the same thing, and how long it had taken him to live with that knowledge. Walter remained behind the wheel, unaware, his future already scheduled without his consent. Ranger stopped at the curb, refusing to move for a moment, eyes fixed on the bus. His tail hung low, still, a silent statement of unease. Ethan understood then that this was the point where stories usually diverged, the point where someone noticed the injustice and turned away, telling themselves it was not their responsibility, the point where systems counted on inertia to do their work for them. He clenched his jaw, breath steadying as resolve settled in its place. Not this time. As the bus pulled away and disappeared into the dark, Ethan made a quiet decision. He did not know yet what action would look like, or how far he would have to go, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This time, he would not stand still. Snow threatened without quite falling, the sky a low metallic gray that pressed down on the city as December 31st slipped toward night. Holiday lights still clung to storefronts and bus shelters, blinking patiently as if they were keeping vigil, but the streets themselves felt subdued, emptied early by families retreating indoors. At the Route 17 terminal, the air smelled of cold rubber and diesel, and the wind moved through the open bays with a restless, searching sound. Walter Hayes sat behind the wheel, hands resting on the steering wheel longer than necessary. He had been called into the operations office an hour earlier, just before his shift. Richard Bloom hadn't closed the door all the way. He hadn't offered Walter a chair. He hadn't raised his voice either, which somehow made the words land harder. "After tonight's run," Bloom had said, eyes flicking to the clipboard in his hands, "you don't need to come back." Walter had nodded. He hadn't asked why. He hadn't argued. He had simply nodded, thanked Bloom for letting him know, and walked back out into the cold. Pride was easier than pleading. Silence had always been cheaper than hope. Now he adjusted his mirrors with slow care and pulled the knit cap lower over his ears. The last run. That was how he framed it in his mind. The only way to keep his hands steady. One final circuit through streets he knew better than his own living room. One final loop of stops and signals and faces that barely noticed him. He exhaled, turned the key, and eased Route 17 out of the bay. Ethan boarded at the first stop, Ranger at his side. He noticed immediately that Walter's shoulders were set differently tonight, drawn inward, as if bracing against something unseen. The driver did not look up. He did not greet anyone. The bus rolled on, tires whispering against damp asphalt. The first few stops passed quietly. The bus felt hollow, its interior echoing faintly with each footstep. A man in a wool coat sat near the back, scrolling through his phone. A teenage girl with earbuds tucked beneath a knit hat claimed a window seat and stared out at the lights without seeing them. No one spoke. Ranger chose the center aisle instead of Ethan's usual row and sat there, posture loose but attentive, tail resting neatly along the floor. His presence divided the bus in two, without effort, a calm anchor in the empty space. A few passengers glanced at him, then away, reassured by his stillness. Walter drove. At the third stop, a familiar figure climbed aboard. Maya Collins shook the cold from her coat and moved down the aisle. Her dark hair pulled back. Fatigue etched lightly into her face, but softened by a small, knowing smile when she saw Ethan. She nodded once in greeting and took a seat near the front. She said nothing to Walter, but her eyes lingered on him for a moment longer than usual. At the next stop, another passenger boarded, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and a scarf wrapped too tightly around his neck. He hesitated at the fare box, glanced at Walter, then moved on without comment. 2 stops later, a woman in a long gray coat stepped inside, carrying a paper bag that smelled faintly of baked bread. She sat near Maya, hands folded in her lap, eyes forward. The bus was filling, but not quickly, not loudly. It wasn't the kind of crowd that arrived all at once. It was the kind that assembled piece by piece, quietly, deliberately, as if following an unspoken agreement. Walter noticed. He checked the mirror more often now, confusion flickering across his lined face. He had driven New Year's Eve before. Usually the bus ran nearly empty, the city abandoning public transit in favor of parties and private celebrations. Tonight felt different. He didn't understand how yet, only that the pattern was off. The rehook came when Ranger shifted. Halfway through the route, as the bus idled at a red light near the river, Ranger rose from his seated position and walked forward, stopping just behind the yellow line. He sat there, squarely facing Walter, head lifted, eyes steady. The bus was silent enough that the soft sound of his breath carried. Walter glanced up, startled. His eyes met the dog's, and for a long moment, neither looked away. Something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps? Or simply shared endurance. Walter swallowed, his grip tightening on the wheel. "You okay, boy?" he murmured, barely audible. Ranger's tail swept once against the floor. Ethan felt a tightening in his chest. Ranger rarely placed himself so deliberately. It was not defiance. It was invitation. The light changed. Walter pulled away, but his breathing had shifted, deeper now, less controlled. He cleared his throat and adjusted his seat, movements betraying strain he could no longer fully hide. More passengers boarded at the next stops. Faces Ethan recognized now. People who had complained before, who had sighed loudly at delays, who had rolled their eyes when Walter didn't smile. Tonight, they said nothing. They took seats. They stayed. The bus grew warm. Walter glanced at the mirror again and again, his brow furrowing. Something wasn't right. He felt it in the weight of eyes on his back, in the density of the air behind him. Not scrutiny, not anger, attention. Near the end of the route, just before midnight, the bus reached the long stretch of road that overlooked the river. Fireworks would be visible from here if the clouds broke, a tradition the city maintained even when no one seemed to be watching. Walter slowed slightly, as he always did, a habit formed years ago when his wife used to ride with him on nights like this. He caught himself, heart stuttering, and almost corrected his speed. Almost. No one complained. No one checked their watch. The bus was nearly full now. Not crowded, but complete. Every seat held someone. Some stood holding straps, swaying gently with the motion. The woman with the bread bag leaned forward and set it on the floor at her feet, as if preparing to offer it. Walter's hands trembled. He pulled into the final stop and set the brake, the hiss of air loud in the sudden quiet. The digital clock above the windshield read 11:59. For a moment, nothing happened. Then someone clapped. Softly at first, then louder. Another followed, then another. The sound grew, filling the bus with warmth that had nothing to do with the heater. Walter turned in his seat, eyes wide, uncomprehending. Maya stood. Her voice carried without effort, "Happy New Year, Walter." The words landed like a physical thing. Walter's mouth opened, then closed. He stood slowly, joints protesting, and turned to face the passengers. He looked smaller out of his seat, thinner, his uniform hanging loosely from his frame. "What's this?" he asked, voice rough. No one answered immediately. They just watched him, faces open, steady. Ranger rose and moved to Walter's side, sitting close enough that his shoulder brushed the man's knee. The clock ticked over. 12 o'clock. Cheers filled the bus, echoing off metal and glass. Someone laughed. Someone wiped their eyes. The woman with the bread stepped forward and pressed the bag into Walter's hands. "For the road," she said simply. Walter stared at it, then at the faces before him. Confusion gave way to something softer, more dangerous. Hope. "This is my last run," he said quietly, the truth slipping out before he could stop it. "After tonight, I'm done." A hush fell, heavy and intentional. Ethan met Maya's eyes across the aisle. She nodded once. "That's not how we see it," she said. Walter shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Company's decision." Silence again. But this time it felt charged, like breath held before a step forward. Walter looked around the bus, at the people who had filled it without explanation, who had stayed without complaint. His chest tightened, emotion pressing up against the careful walls he had built over years of endurance. "This isn't right," he said finally, more to himself than to anyone else. "Something's off." Ranger leaned into him, solid and warm. For the first time that night, Walter smiled. Not wide, not practiced, just a small uncertain curve of the lips that trembled as it formed. He looked at the road ahead, then back at the faces behind him, and felt something shift inside his chest. Not fear, not loss, possibility. The night after the New Year's Eve run did not end cleanly. It lingered in the city like a held breath, stretched thin between fireworks that had already faded and a morning that had not yet decided what it would bring. By the time Route 17 rolled back into the terminal, applause had quieted, passengers had dispersed, and Walter Hayes sat alone again behind the wheel, hands resting on the steering wheel, as if he were afraid that letting go might undo whatever fragile warmth had just existed. Ethan stayed behind. He waited until the last passenger stepped off, until the bus hummed softly in its idle, and the terminal echoed with emptiness. Ranger lay at his feet, calm but watchful, eyes following Walter's reflection in the glass. Walter did not turn around. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, shoulders rigid, the smile from midnight already dissolving into something cautious and uncertain. "I didn't plan that," Walter said finally, voice rough, as if unused. "I don't know what they were thinking." Ethan stepped forward and stood beside the driver's seat. Up close, Walter looked older than ever, the skin around his eyes thin and drawn, the lines at the corners of his mouth deepened by years of restraint. His uniform hung loosely from his frame, as though it belonged to a man who had been larger once. "They were thinking the same thing you were," Ethan said quietly. That tonight mattered. Walter let out a short breath, half a laugh, half a sigh. Doesn't change what's coming. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew a folded stack of papers, edges worn soft from handling. He placed them gently on the dashboard, between the steering wheel and the windshield. Walter frowned, finally turning to look. What's that? Ethan unfolded the top page. Names filled it in uneven handwriting, some careful, some rushed, some barely legible. Addresses followed, phone numbers, short notes scribbled in margins. It's a petition, Ethan said. Started last night. Walter stared at the pages, confusion slowly giving way to recognition. Those are the passengers. Yes. Ethan flipped to the second page, then the third. They asked me to help put it together. Not because I'm special, because I stayed. Walter swallowed. His hands trembled as he reached out, fingers brushing the paper without quite touching it. Ethan continued, his voice steady. It tells your story. It tells Liam's story. It explains what happens if you're gone. It's not angry. It's not a threat. It's a record. Ranger rose and stepped closer, sitting beside Walter's knee. His presence was grounding, solid. Walter rested one hand against the dog's thick fur, eyes glistening. I didn't want anyone to know, Walter murmured. About the boy. I know, Ethan said. They figured it out anyway. By morning, the petition had grown. Maya Collins took it first. She moved through the hospital corridors with practiced efficiency, her navy scrubs creased from a long night, her expression calm but determined. She was not a loud woman. She did not posture or demand. She simply spoke to people as she always had, with clarity and respect. To fellow nurses, to doctors between rounds, to parents sitting in waiting rooms clutching coffee gone cold, she explained who Walter was, what he did, and what it would mean if he disappeared. Signatures followed. By midday, images of Route 17 began circulating online. A photo of Walter standing awkwardly in the aisle, clutching a paper bag of bread. A short video of Ranger sitting in the center aisle, unflinching, eyes forward, as the clock turned midnight. Captions appeared beneath them, written by people who had ridden the bus for years without ever learning the driver's name. He gets us home. He never missed a stop. He showed up when no one else did. The rehook arrived not with confrontation, but with momentum. Ethan was standing at the terminal when his phone vibrated. A message flashed across the screen. Then another, and another. Shares multiplied faster than he could read them. Comments stacked beneath the images, strangers adding their own stories, their own gratitude, their own quiet outrage. Ranger lifted his head, ears pricked, as if sensing the shift in energy before Ethan could fully comprehend it. Across town, Richard Bloom stared at his monitor in disbelief. He sat alone in his office, jacket draped over the back of his chair, tie loosened. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. On his screen, the company's social media feed refreshed again and again, each update bringing another wave of attention. Mentions, tags, messages. The name, Walter Hayes, appeared in places Bloom had never expected to see it. He leaned back slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. Bloom looked tired, older than his 53 years, his hairline receding more than he liked to admit. The lines around his mouth deepened by a lifetime of swallowing objections. He had been a good driver once. He had loved the quiet competence of it, the way the road rewarded attention. That man felt distant now, buried beneath spreadsheets and performance metrics. His phone rang. The caller ID showed corporate headquarters. Bloom answered, voice measured. Richard Bloom. He listened in silence as the voice on the other end spoke, clipped and urgent. He nodded once, then again, though no one could see him. "Yes," he said. "I understand." When the call ended, Bloom remained seated, staring at the wall. He thought of Walter, of the old buses he had driven alongside him years ago, of the way Walter had covered shifts without complaint. He thought of the memo he had signed without argument. Keep the KPI, cut the cost, or keep the man. The bus terminal filled again that evening, though it wasn't yet time for Route Centene. Passengers gathered in small clusters, some holding phones, others holding printed copies of the petition. They did not chant. They did not shout. They waited. Walter arrived last, walking slowly, confusion etched into every line of his face. He wore the same uniform, the same knit cap. He looked around at the crowd, at the familiar faces standing together, and stopped short. "What's going on?" he asked. Ethan stepped forward, placing the stack of papers into Walter's hands once more. Thicker now, heavier with names. "They're standing with you," he said. Ranger sat at Walter's side, gaze steady. Across the terminal, Richard Bloom watched from the doorway of the operations office. He saw the crowd, he saw the dog, he saw the driver who had once been just a line item become something else entirely. His phone buzzed again. Another message from headquarters, this one shorter. "Do not escalate. Assess options." Bloom exhaled. The digital clock above the terminal doors ticked forward, seconds dropping like weights into silence. The decision had not yet been made. It hovered, suspended between fear and responsibility, between what was easy and what was right. Walter looked up at Ethan, eyes searching. "Does this mean—" Ethan shook his head gently. "Not yet." Ranger's tail thumped once against the floor. The crowd waited, and somewhere behind glass and numbers, the system hesitated. Midnight returned quietly, as if the city itself had learned restraint. Route 17 waited at the terminal, engine humming low, its windows fogged from the warmth inside. Beyond the glass, fireworks bloomed above the river, brief explosions of color that fractured and reassembled themselves in reflection. Gold, red, white. They shimmered across the windshield in broken patterns, bending with the curve of the glass, as if the new year were arriving in pieces before finding its shape. Walter Hayes sat behind the wheel, posture stiff, hands resting where they had rested for decades. The terminal clock above the doors blinked to 00 circle, its digital certainty marking the boundary between years. Applause rippled faintly from somewhere outside, carried on the cold air. Inside the bus, no one spoke. The passengers were still there. They had not left after the gathering. Some stood near the doors, coats pulled tight, breath fogging the glass. Others remained seated, quiet and patient, as though they understood that this moment required stillness. Maya Collins leaned against a pole near the front, arms folded loosely, eyes on Walter. Her face looked softer now. The tension of the past days eased, but not erased. Ethan stood near the center aisle, Ranger pressed against his leg. The dog's body was relaxed, his weight familiar and grounding. His ears flicked occasionally at distant sounds, but his gaze remained steady, untroubled. Whatever vigilance had guided him here had settled into something calmer. Walter cleared his throat, the sound small in the hushed space. He adjusted the mirror out of habit, then stopped himself. There was no route to check yet, no schedule to follow, only time, suspended. His phone vibrated in his jacket pocket. He froze. For a heartbeat, he didn't move. The device buzzed again, insistently, the vibration traveling through the thin fabric and into his chest. Walter's hands trembled as he reached for it, fingers clumsy, betraying a fear he had carried quietly for days. Ethan watched him, breath held. Walter read the message once, then again. His brow furrowed, confusion cutting through exhaustion. Slowly, carefully, as if afraid the words might vanish if he moved too quickly. He lowered the phone to his lap. Richard Bloom's name glowed on the screen. The message was brief. Contract extended. Full benefits. We'll talk details Monday. Happy New Year. Walter stared at it, eyes filling before he fully understood why. His shoulders sagged, the rigid line of his back finally giving way. He exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to release months, maybe years, of held tension. He looked up. No one cheered, no one clapped. They simply watched him, faces open, waiting. Walter swallowed. His mouth twitched, uncertain, then curved upward, not into a grin, not into anything practiced or loud, but into the smallest smile imaginable. It barely lifted the corners of his lips, a fragile thing that trembled as it formed, as though unused to daylight. He began, then stopped. Words failed him. He nodded instead, once, twice, pressing his lips together, as if that were enough to hold himself steady. Maya stepped forward first. She did not hug him. She did not speak. She simply reached out and squeezed his forearm, firm and reassuring. Her eyes shone, but her smile was calm, professional, the way it always was when she stood beside someone who had just been given more time. Others followed in quiet gestures. A nod, a hand briefly placed over the heart. Someone murmured, "Glad you're staying." Someone else whispered, "Happy New Year, Walter," as if saying his name mattered now. Ranger rose and moved closer, sitting at Walter's side. He leaned gently against the man's leg, solid and warm. Walter rested a hand on the dog's head without thinking, fingers threading into thick fur. The contact grounded him, anchored him in the present. The rehook came not with spectacle, but with realization. Ethan felt it then, the subtle shift that marked an ending and a beginning at once. The knowledge settled quietly in his chest, heavy but clear. This was not victory in the way stories usually told it. There was no single enemy defeated, no system overturned in a moment of righteousness. The machinery still existed, the metrics still mattered. Nothing fundamental had been rewritten, and yet something had held. Ranger shifted back toward Ethan and sat, then leaned his full weight against Ethan's leg. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his head and rested it against Ethan's knee. The gesture was intimate, unguarded, the kind that came only when vigilance was no longer required. Ethan placed a hand on Ranger's neck, fingers curling into familiar fur. He felt the steady rise and fall of the dog's breath, calm and even. He thought of all the times he had stood before, years ago, watching outcomes unfold that he could not change, or had convinced himself he could not change. He had followed orders then, believing that obedience was the same as necessity. He had told himself that the cost was unavoidable. Tonight had taught him something quieter. He hadn't saved Walter. He hadn't dismantled Metroline or exposed some grand corruption. He had not rescued a child from illness or rewritten the rules that tied survival to employment. He had simply stayed. He had noticed. He had listened. He had stood in the right place long enough for others to recognize themselves in the moment. That was all. And somehow, it had been enough. Walter cleared his throat again, emotion steadying into resolve. He straightened in his seat, hands returning to the wheel with renewed purpose. The bus felt different now. Not lighter, not easier, but real in a way it hadn't before. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's get you home." A murmur of assent moved through the bus. Coats were adjusted, bags lifted. Someone laughed softly at nothing in particular. The ordinary resumed, but it carried a new weight, one that felt earned. Walter released the brake. Route 17 eased forward, tires rolling over pavement that still glistened faintly from fireworks fallout and winter damp. Outside, the city continued its slow return to routine. Inside, the bus moved as it always had, steady and sure. Ethan took a seat near the middle. Ranger curled at his feet, head still resting against his leg. Through the window, fireworks reflected once more. Distant now, fading quickly into smoke and darkness. Walter glanced at the mirror, catching Ethan's eye for a brief moment. He nodded, just once, not in thanks. In acknowledgement, the bus rolled on, crossing the invisible threshold into the new year. One man held the wheel. A community held onto its humanity. And the road ahead, for the first time in a long while, felt possible. Sometimes, the miracles we wait for do not arrive with thunder or fire from the sky. They arrive quietly, through ordinary people who choose not to look away. Through a driver who keeps showing up when no one notices. Through a community that remembers a name instead of a number. Through a man who stands still long enough for truth to surface. In our daily lives, God's work often moves through simple obedience to compassion. A seat offered, a voice raised at the right moment, a hand placed where it is needed most. These moments may seem small, but they are often the very places where grace takes root and grows. This story reminds us that we are not always called to save the world. Sometimes, we are called to be present, to protect what is fragile, and to stand beside those who are quietly carrying more than they should. When we do that, we become part of a miracle that continues long after the moment has passed. If this story touched your heart, consider sharing it with someone who may need a reminder that they are seen. Leave a comment and tell us what this story made you reflect on. And if you believe in stories that honor compassion, courage, and quiet faith, please subscribe to Silent Paws Steady Hearts so we can continue sharing them together. May God bless you and your family. May He protect you in unseen ways, guide your steps in moments of doubt, and place the right people beside you when you need strength. And may you be a source of light and mercy in the everyday moments where miracles are born.